Good evening, everybody. And it's very nice to say that because we don't do many things in the evening here at the Institute. But thankfully, with the sunshine outside, everyone's been able to come after work or study or other. And we're really happy to have you here in central Dublin. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here. I have a very easy job, as I often do, because I just get to introduce our two participants today, mainly just to thank Professor Ed Burke, who is the Assistant Professor in the History of Warfare after 1945 at UCD, my alma. And Ed is also very active, involved in the Institute with their Security and Defence Group and other things. Ed, thanks very, very much for being with us. You're going to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is an eminent think tanker who requires very little introduction. But nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to introduce Constanze. And just again, a sincere thanks to you, Ed, and to Constanze as well.
Well, thank you very much to the Institute, to Barry, and to the very distinguished guest that we have here. It's wonderful to have this beautiful evening session. And it's also a particular pleasure. Barry described our guest here tonight as, an international relations rock star. And I think that is absolutely bang on the money.
I will walk away.
If IR does rock stars, you're in the presence of that.
It's not quite you too,
And it does fall upon me to give you at least 2 paragraphs of your very extensive bio, just so nobody is in any doubt of your various achievements over many years, and you'll have to blush your way through the next 2 or 3 minutes. Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution in Washington. She's a German citizen. She's an expert in German, European, and transatlantic foreign and security policy, and as well has a background in international law and human rights. From 2019 to 2020, Dr. Stelzenmüller held the Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress.
6-month sabbatical with a pompous title.
Yeah, and the fanciest office, I believe, one of the fanciest offices in what? Well,
yes, I had the most glorious cubicle you have ever seen with a view of the United States Supreme Court, and that I do actually miss. It was amazing.
Yeah. And it's from 2014 to 2019, she also served as the inaugural Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Prior to Brookings, she directed the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And she later served as the Senior Transatlantic Fellow, heading the Transatlantic Trends Program. Her work in the think tank sphere comes after a very distinguished career in journalism, including the role of Defense and International Security Editor in Die Zeit from 1994 to 2005. She is extremely well quoted and a frequent author, of course, in the US and transatlantic media, not least, of course, for the Financial Times. So, Constance, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here in Dublin. We've had a series of really engaging meetings today and indeed tomorrow. But I suppose it falls upon me to, despite the wonderfully joyous spring, pleasant sunshine and atmosphere, I'm going to sort of bring the tone down a little bit and ask you quite plainly, in terms of looking at Europe's future and Europe's strategic outcomes, how serious is it?
All right. First of all, let me say thank you for inviting me here. It's my 2nd or maybe 3rd time back. I'm sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Is that working? I think you might want to take it down. It's okay? All right. I also wanted to say that I am now very relieved that I didn't have time to change into a skirt, because these are what I call manspreading chairs. So, everything is all right. And thank you indeed for coming here when there is a glorious spring evening outside. We will try and make it worth your while. How serious is it, the other thing I was just thinking is that when you start getting called distinguished, you really feel your age. And I've been around a couple of transatlantic crises, right? Some that felt really bad at the time, right? I was a young journalist I started at Die Zeit in '94, as you said, and before that I was an intern. And I remember, the genocidal wars in Africa and in the Balkans and the fights that the Americans had with the Europeans over that, then the fight over Afghanistan, the fight over Iraq, the global financial crisis, there's been a fair amount going on in the transatlantic relationship. But what I see happening now is something that is completely different. Because it really touches all aspects of our life, security, economy, and domestic politics, and the nature of international and domestic orders, right? And because it is beginning to look as though our most important ally, the guardian of the post-war rules-based international order, and the guardian of Europe, is changing sides, right? That is not something I could ever imagine. I'm living in America now. I'm living there for the third time in my life. I lived there as a child, went to graduate school there, and it is a country that I thought I knew deeply, that I admire, that I love, where I have many, many friends, right? Liberal and conservative, Democrats and Republicans, and whose current administration is doing things that I think we have to protect ourselves against. And that to me is just a chilling realization that some aspects of which I sort of was intuiting, because I moved to Washington this time around in 2014, and I'd lived through the entire first Trump administration. And at the time, because they hired me as a Germany and Europe explainer, I'd also been following the hard right in Europe and in Germany. So naturally, I started tracking the thinking of the hard right on both sides of the Atlantic. So there are some things that I thought, if worst came to worst, that could develop along certain lines. But there are things I did not have on my internal bingo card, such as, the desire to acquire Greenland or Canada, right? Or some of the more outlandish ideas about reshaping the global fiscal order and the global monetary order. That is really astonishing. But we can come to that in more detail.
I mean, so obviously we've listened to a lot of very hostile rhetoric from the United States towards the European Union in particular. I mean, is this simply an opening gambit from a new administration, or are we looking at a real visceral desire to unravel, disentangle, or even destroy the European Union?
Mm. So I think the answer to that is yes, no, and maybe. And let me try and disentangle that, right? Or it's sort of like Schrodinger's cat, right? It is and it isn't. So Trump himself is a man of profound, deeply rooted and unchanged convictions that were shaped in the 1970s and 80s, and that are in many ways rooted in thinking of the 19th century, right? On the other hand, he is extraordinarily impulsive. He is not what I think anyone would call a strategist, and he can retract. He's a bully, I think, through and through, but he can retract efforts at bullying, right? That makes it confusing to watch. At the same time, I think what's different in this second administration is that he is surrounded by people who do have very strategic thoughts, and who have spent the past 4 years during the Biden administration, first angry at not having been able to get things done in the first administration because it was ill-prepared, and absolutely, utterly determined to get them done this time around. And in fact, to get them done before the midterms, right? Which gives them a 22-month timeline, right? And which I think explains a great deal of the speed, scope, and brutality with which this administration has proceeded to take down things which it thinks are in its way, right? That said, and that's my final sort of answer to you to this question, that said, one of the interesting things that I also hadn't really had on my radar is that despite the fact that Trump this time around has a popular majority, a Senate majority, and a House majority, albeit a narrow one in the latter case, which they're currently worried about because there's some by-elections coming up in Florida and in Wisconsin. Despite that being the case, the MAGA camp, and despite all the talk about the unitary government that would now ensue, the MAGA camp is actually quite profoundly ideologically and strategically divided on key questions, It is not divided on others, but it's worth, if I may, sort of quickly referencing that. So I had been following what I call the reactionary national conservatives for quite a while. This is a religious fusionist movement of evangelicals, ultra-Catholics, and a couple of Orthodox Jewish intellectuals who sort of are striving to turn the American constitutional order into something quite different from what it is now. One that, and for whom foreign and security policy are actually, I think, secondary considerations, but who really think that there should be establishment of church and state in America, for example, who are very much white nationalists, and so on and so on, right? And these people want a really strong state that legislates the common good, right? They want watertight borders, no immigration, and as far as they're concerned, China is a hostile entity that needs to be repelled. That is what I had been following, and they're very strong. Their key exponents are people like J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller, who are profoundly ideological in ways that for European students of history, of political history, and the European hard right are recognizable in their beliefs and in the way these beliefs have been shaped. But there is another group that I didn't have so much on my radar screen. I knew of its existence. I didn't realize how much political power it would have. And those are what I would call radical libertarians. The chief exponent of which, of course, is Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is not alone. He has more money and a more powerful social platform than anybody else. But actually around him is a whole cohort of Silicon Valley broligarchs, as they're now called, right? Who, after a decade or so of being committed Democrats and blue donors, have suddenly undergone an authoritarian turn. And there is a fair amount of literature written about this. One of them is Mark Andreessen, who gave an interview to the New York Times saying that he was offended by interns thinking they were doing bad things, and that was when he decided no longer to be a Democrat. I simplify marginally. And because they have so much money and so much technological power, they are actually generally important forces. And they want no state, no regulations, open borders for qualified immigration, and a very friendly relationship with China, which accounts for a third of Musk's business, right? And so these are ideological divisions, and they are strategic divisions. That said, they agree that representative democracy is not fit for purpose. They have contempt for the Europeans, and they think the European hard right are their friends. And there is personal overlap in that Elon Musk has campaigned for the German hard right, the AfD, and Peter Thiel is a mentor to J.D. Vance, right? So the camps do then sort of interlace again. But the divisions are important, and I think that they, especially in the domain of China policy, are going to create a fair amount of confusion.
And in the terms, obviously, tomorrow we have a much anticipated day that will sort of dampen the sunshine.
Liberation Day, April 2nd.
And in terms
Tariff
of
Day,
there are some people, and David Lammy has come out and said that Trump is his transactional sort of opening statements, and
yes,
we will.
I didn't answer your question on that point.
And I was just going to ask you just about. There are others who are more concerned that there is a coherence here in terms of a much longer plan, economic plan, and the tariffs are sort of just one phase of that. Where do you sit on that? Is this just Trump kind of trying to kind of brazen out an opening stance and then sort of compromising in months to come? Are we looking at a much longer, more arduous ideological campaign in terms of the Trump administration to reorientate the American economy and the global economy?
So I think it's both, and again that makes it confusing, right? I think that Trump himself and a remarkable number of people around him think that because they are America, because they are the holders of supreme power in the sole superpower, sort of a mere expression of will or a slight threat with geoeconomic coercion is enough to change political behavior. a footnote here. Trump doesn't like the military, except in the way it wears uniforms, right? But he doesn't actually like to use it, except for very long distance strikes against people like Qasem Soleimani, the ISIS leader, no, Iranian, sorry, Iranian, the IRGC leader, exactly, or the Houthis, right? Anything that involves sort of hand-to-hand combat, not so good. That's not, he thinks that is not for America. So, but he does, I think, and even more, the people around him seem to have the idea that it is time to once and for all remedy imbalances in the global security order and in the global financial order that work against America, that have undercut American manufacturing, contributed to the financialization of the American economy, and that have permitted America's allies to get away with exploitation of America's security umbrella. And the thing is, there is, of course, a kernel of truth in all this. Of course, we have all us Europeans, and certainly my country, right? We've been egregious free riders on the American security provision. That said, it was a codependency, right? That said, it was encouraged. And in fact, when we occasionally tried to break out of it as Europeans or individually, it was discreetly discouraged. Right? Anybody who knows the ins and outs of transatlantic relations can confirm that. That said, we also were very good at exploiting this, right? And so it was like all codependent relationships, right? Both sides were willing participants and felt coerced and victimized at the same time, right? That's why codependent relationships are not good, right? But there is now a feeling that they can sort of break things and stop it. And the way in which they are proceeding to break things, I have to say, is if you look at sort of the writings of the MAGA world on these topics, that is profoundly concerning, right? And I don't think we are remotely intellectually, politically, in our security thinking and our security provisions prepared for that, right? And in fact, I was telling Ed that I have been doing catch-up reading throughout my trip, right? And I was actually just reading today a report that I'd been meaning to read for a very long time, that was written November 2024, which I think we should revert to quoting later to give you an idea of what I mean. But it is, so in other words, but just to come back to Ed's, sort of the key point of Ed's question, this is all both transactional and strategic. And it is transactional in the sense that Trump will occasionally walk back on things and will get upset. Example, right? The administration clearly thought that it could come to a very fast agreement with the Russians over the head of the Ukrainians, or with minimal participation by the Ukrainians on a ceasefire in Ukraine. It has become very clear that the Russians have absolutely no intention of underwriting a ceasefire, and in fact have been stringing the White House along. And Trump is now upset. You've all heard the expression he used. And it's not clear to me yet what exactly happens as a consequence of that, whether they try another round, or whether Trump actually implements his threat of secondary sanctions on Russian energy exports. That would be interesting, because the Americans have already, the Trump White House has already made so many really important sort of signals and concessions on key talking points of the Russians, that arguably these are things that can't be walked back, right? But the Kremlin is now saying, and Putin himself is now saying, this ceasefire is not going to happen unless we address, and this is the key quote, the root causes of the conflict. And the root causes of the conflict is a crucial expression, because it refers to it is something that Putin has kept harping on, both in this famous history essay that he wrote in the summer of 2021, where he said, where he, frankly, is a long and turgid piece of history writing that shows very little actual historian expertise, right? But where Putin constructs this entire narrative that, of course, is intended to delegitimize Ukraine and provide a narrative vehicle justifying invasion, right? But again, the root causes point means it's all NATO's fault. The West encroached upon us, and therefore we are entitled to invade and brutalize Ukraine, right? Then some of you will recall, obviously, people like Ed and I are obsessed with this kind of detail, but it is worth recalling. The Kremlin in December, late December, just before Christmas, sent an identical treaty draft, quote unquote treaty draft, to the White House and to NATO headquarters, saying that the root causes of the conflict had really been laid in 1997 with the enlargement of NATO towards Eastern Europe and the stationing of NATO assets and American assets in Eastern Europe. And that this was the larger narrative context for the hostility towards Ukraine, right? That was at a time when it was already becoming clear that the Kremlin was pre-positioning military assets around three of Ukraine's borders. And I remember that at the time people were saying this is just it's a feint, right? This is something that is clearly non-negotiable for the West, and he's trying to distract us. And it's become clear, right, that this is what Putin wanted all along. He wanted to have us in a place where he could negotiate with the Americans over the head of the Europeans to roll back the European security order created through the enlargement of NATO and the EU, right? And which ultimately means getting American troops and nuclear weapons out of Europe, and which would then, I think, fairly automatically result in Europe becoming an American part of the Russian sphere of influence, right? And that's where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that if we look back, if we look back in recent history, and we think back to the Doha agreements, for example, with the United States, once Trump and his administration are not interested in prosecuting the war, they'll lower and lower the demands, it seems, until they sort of manage to get out anyway because they've made the decision that they're not interested. The palpable lack of interest in prosecuting this war is clearly very alarming, given that Ukraine is much more important to Europe than Afghanistan was. But at the same time, is Europe still of primary importance to the United States? And so if they want to reduce the defense bill, which they clearly absolutely want to do, they've said they will, a very good way of doing that is obviously withdrawing US spending from US military presence in Europe.
Is there anybody who hasn't read the Signal chat by now?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was at the Munich Security Conference for the Vance speech. I was not in the same room. I was in the overflow of the overflow of the overflow. I've been going to the Munich Security Conference for a long time, and I've never had to be in the third overflow, right? I mean, it was absolutely packed because everybody knew this was going to be it. This was going to be the definitive speech for the transatlantic relationship. And it was following on something that's forgotten. Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had just gone to a NATO ministerial and said, given a sort of somewhat hostile and in some ways ambivalent speech, in which he said that while America was prepared to maintain the nuclear deterrent for the benefit of Europe, there would be a significant withdrawal of American conventional forces, right? And so everybody expected Vance's speech to be the second shoe that dropped, right? And that would detail the size of the withdrawal of conventional force. Instead of which, J.D. Vance gave a speech in which he harangued Europeans, and especially the Germans, for, as he said, overregulating their economic spaces and violating free speech by refusing to engage with the European far right, and in the case of the Germans, by the harangue the conservatives specifically for maintaining this firewall against cooperating with the Alternative for Germany, the hard right party, right? Which I have to say, I mean, you know, the outrage in that conference venue was universal, right? And the shock. I've really not quite seen anything like it. And it was, you know, it was a very obvious election interference. And then, of course, afterwards, that was on, I think the 14th. Yeah, that was on February 14th. And then our election was on the 23rd. And in between the 14th and the 23rd, Elon Musk campaigned for the AfD, right? Several times. And it will not have escaped your notice that there are now sort of reports about the Americans and the Russians having conversations about turning on Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, right? Notably, the Germans have not been included in these conversations, right? And I had been wondering, you know, I thought, you know, the only way that this happens, right, that the pipeline was turned on, is if the AfD is actually in government, because that's the only party, except from the hard left, which was voted out mostly, willing to turn the taps back on. And that suggests, you know, not understanding how German politics works, but it also suggests that after this incoming government has finished its coalition negotiations, hopefully shortly after Easter, that we will be seeing a very, very unpleasant phase of continual support for the German hard right, right? Which is pretty shocking. And of course, add on to that the signal chat conversation, right? And the sort of dripping contempt expressed there, right? The pathetic Europeans, and we're bailing them out again, and we want to make them pay, right? If we crack down on the Houthis, then they have to pay, right? And this, that would be my last point, that comes to another thing that I hadn't really quite seen about this administration, which is the emphasis on predatory extraction of rent, right? Or of territory, right? The revised Ukrainian critical minerals deal that Zelensky has now said he won't sign because the revision is so stark, right? That practically all income from almost all economic activity in Ukraine would revert to the United States, right? That is, I mean, predatory is you know, feels like a euphemism for that, right? And then, of course, the pressure brought to bear on Greenland and Denmark and on the Canadians, saying you need to be with us, and if you're not with us, you know, you're bad allies, and this is ridiculous, and you will be subject to tariffs, and why are you not, you know, why are you resisting us? Right? I mean, that is not something I could have ever have imagined, right? And so there is a sense that there is not only resentment and contempt for allies, but also a feeling that back payments are due, right? Which is
yeah, and we're also
stunning.
in a very troubling era when we have Elon Musk is we clearly we have Mark Zuckerberg, who are clearly trying to align themselves. Well, one is in the administration, the other is trying to align himself to the administration, and both are sort of, you know, heavily involved in the propagation of. I mean, we're looking at significant current and future interference in our political affairs in terms of undermining European democracies from the United States, and a number of those companies are obviously headquartered here in Dublin, which are so that's a huge test for Ireland and the European Commission in terms of, you know, trying to push back against that type of interference.
So before that's let me remind you that before Vance came to Munich, he was in Paris at the AI conference convened by the French presidency. And he gave a speech on AI in which he said, we intend to exert dominance in this technological space. And you Europeans had better not resist it, right? And that was already, you know, raised a lot of eyebrows, not to mention hackles, right? And then was overtaken, right, by the impact of the speech in Munich, and before that, you know, the speech by Hegseth. But that is, this is where the sort of the libertarian wing sort of has a really, really strong interest in Europe not putting up regulatory barriers to their technological enterprises and to their platforms, right? And so the whole, I think the opposition to regulating free speech, right, or hate speech, as we would say, at least in Germany, is ideological on the one hand, but there is also a very strong commercial angle to this. And those two things actually these days seem to go hand in hand. Right.
There does seem to be, and again, there are major splits in the administration on this, but I wanted to ask you about this kind of tripartite vision of global affairs, whereby, Europe is simply not a significant player, and it's sort of Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, with the possible addition of New Delhi at some point, as the kind of, the four major powers that have spheres of influence and dominance, and Europe doesn't seem to fit into that. But of course, we also have major, significant China hawks in Washington as well. So where do you think that might land? I mean, who is going to, in this kind of this contest between confrontation with China versus accommodation, or even transaction with Taiwan or something?
Right.
Where exactly are we on that?
So this is one of the other sort of genuinely confusing and I think sort of incoherent policy areas that has yet to sort of sort itself out. I was saying earlier, the libertarians, don't have a problem with China, really, right? Probably aren't that interested in Taiwan. And Trump himself has said, Taiwan, not my business, right? They stole our chips technology, right?
Yes,
Which is wild, but there you are, right? And, if I were the Dutch chip maker ASML, I would also be having thoughts with the capital T. But it was notable that the incoming policy director at DoD, Elbridge Colby, who is has always been one of the most insistent and strident China hawks in Washington, gave a highly muted performance at his confirmation hearings, right? In ways that were widely commented on. And more generally, the hawkish voices haven't really been heard. That said, the Washington Post yesterday had a piece citing a non-public, presumably classified, interim strategic guidance, defense guidance document at some length, so clearly it was given to somebody, which was very hawkish in China, and suggested that was now the only pacing challenge, and had language on Europe that suggested that, or that made it much clearer even than the Hegseth speech in Brussels that I'd previously mentioned, that conventional support of Europe was not going to be available. Full stop, end of. That said, right, there are now reports, and in fact, the first one who reported this was Finbar Birmingham, Irish journalist who's worked for the South China Morning Post, who said there were Chinese government reports, which I since have seen echoed elsewhere, that the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Koreans had announced together, or had announced that they would resist American tariffs together, or undertake countermeasures and against American tariffs together. I mean, that I have to say, I haven't fully digested this information yet, because that would be a stunning reversal for the Biden administration's very, very carefully and expertly, right, and lovingly crafted Quad policies around China, right? They invested a huge amount of energy and expertise and diplomatic labor in improving relations with Vietnam and Thailand and the Philippines and other countries, right? And again, I've been sort of running around all day here, so I have, I feel I'm probably, grievously behind the news cycle in many ways already. But so I haven't corroborated that to my personal satisfaction. But if that is true, that is absolutely wild, to put it in technical terms. Right.
I wanted to ask you a last question. Then we've got some questions coming in here, and then we'll open up to the floor as well. So our online participants, feel free to put your questions in the chat. But I wanted to just ask you the last question, which is, look, there are people Marco Rubio mentioned that, Europe is not united, that this idea that the European Union will act coherently or can even engage in any strategic autonomy when it comes to defense is pie in the sky, because he looks and he says, have you been to Rome and have you been to Berlin? There are significant, these are two of the greatest member states, two of the largest member states. Giorgia Meloni is talking a conciliatory language about relationships with Washington. You experienced the absolutely chastening, freezing atmosphere of Munich. Are we overly optimistic to think that given the continuation of defense orders to buy F-35s and everything else, that really, that despite the pumping in of the rearm program, that really this is a divided Europe where Northern Europe, Central Europe cares, the Baltics care, Mediterranean states are much more ambiguous, and that the prospect for European strategic autonomy is not great. So what needs to happen? UK relations, what has to happen for this to work?
Okay, it's impossible to give a short answer to that question, right? Yeah. But I'll do my best. And again, I think based on current data points, right? Remember, the election was on November 5th. The inauguration was on January 20th. It hasn't been that long, and it already feels like years have happened, right? Reminds you of the famous Lenin quote, right? There are decades where nothing happens, and then weeks when decades happen. But I think based on the data points that we have, you can make both one case and the opposite case, right? So we know only too well how easily we are divided. And we know just how extraordinarily good domestic extremists and external supporters of those extremists have become at pitting us against each other, right? On the other hand, you could also say that we're seeing something of a revival of political centrism, right? And you can read the recent German election on February 23rd both ways, right? The AfD doubled its seats in the Bundestag, yet we have an incoming grand coalition, right? And we are going to have to deal with these political ambivalences, I think. But what I really want to say, and I believe that, is that we can see this as a present at the destruction moment, to quote the famous book by, no, it wasn't Dulles, it was what's, oh my God, I'm blanking, Present at the Creation, 1954, not John Ford. Sorry?
George Atchison?
I'm not sure there was, actually, yes, you're right, Atchison, exactly, you're quite right. Yeah. Right, I always confuse those two. In any case, I do think that this could also be a recreation moment, right? The destruction is evident, right? The intent to blow things up is very evident. And part of it, we have to bluntly say, is working. And it's frightening people. It's frightening people in America, and it's frightening us, and with good reason. But I'm also seeing things happening that I hadn't thought possible, right? I've just come from England and from a conference about sort of UK-EU cooperation and improving that. And I came away from that thinking everybody is really willing to do this, right? And they're willing to be non-ideological and pragmatic about this, and they know that time is of the essence, right? Which is really good news, right? It does kind of you could argue that actually puts Ireland even more of a spot, right? Because you've sort of always existed in this triangle of US, UK, France, and if the EU, and if the UK moves closer to the EU, then that triangle changes a little bit. But let me put it in a slightly non-cheerful way, which is that I don't see Putin, right, declaring peace anytime soon. I think that, in fact, it would be personally risky to Putin's health and presumably his life if he sort of stepped out of the war mode, right? He has now fully and completely identified himself with the war that he's waging on Ukraine and on Europe, right? And never forget that he's waging war in Europe every day through hybrid means, something that we in Germany are very conscious of. And if I'm correct, that this American administration has a deep disrespect for Europe, and also in ways that are not unlike Vladimir Putin, despises what we think of as the core tenets of the European project, which is liberal modernity, political pluralism, the separation and balance of powers, and the protection of the rights of minorities, the protection of civil liberties. If they hold all that in contempt, for which there is by now a significant amount of evidence, right, then we are dealing with, we are being confronted on both sides with some very, very large forces capable of entirely reshaping the political universe in which we live. And if that isn't enough to motivate anyone, right, I don't know what is, right? And I do think, personally, that we are each other's best hope, right? And I will also say, as a German who was in her late 20s when the wall came down, right? And I'm the child of war children, right? And I have, as a journalist and as a reporter, been to war zones, covered the Rwandan genocide, right? I covered war crimes tribunals out of the Yugoslav wars, right? I know both through both through inheritance and through personal experience what war is like, and I don't want it. I don't want it in Europe. And I think that we are perfectly capable of mustering the strength as nations, as Europeans, and as citizens of resisting that, right? So there are lots of theological questions that we can then consider, right? What's the role of the EU? What's the role of NATO? Do you have to be in NATO? Not really. Do you have to be in the EU? Not really. We just need to be pragmatic about this and do it.
Yeah, and it's quite remarkable to see the extension of whether it's the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, or whether it's the Weimar Plus now, the sort of, we have sort of, these are emerging embryonic platforms for defense that are actually outside both NATO and the EU, which are quite interesting.
Yeah, but why is that the case? Because we have hostile members.
Yes, we do.
In both formats now, right? We have the Hungarians who are torpedoing decision-making in NATO and the EU, and we have the Americans who are threatening to withdraw their Supreme Allied Commander Europe, right, SACEUR, who is the sort of key figure in the command line for the employment of the nuclear deterrent, right? And so that makes it necessary, right, to have decision-making formats that are not unanimous, right? And unanimity rules in all main key decisions, both in NATO and in the EU. Right.
And that potentially could be the future of sort of hard European power if it needs to be directed eastwards, is that we will not be able to do it through the mechanisms, institutions which we expected in which to face down these things. And that creates an enormous challenge in itself, and possibly adds an impetus to even more UK involvement in the EU defence market, if that can be our defence programs, if that can be advanced.